Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And we're calling from Toronto. We're calling from Toronto. I'm going to first introduce ourselves. We're fortunate enough to be one of the oldest wine distributors in Ontario. Founded by my late grandfather, our business is now run by my father, Todd, my uncle Colin, and me being the third generation in the business, all of whom are on the call with us today. For our first episode of Crew Classé at Home, we are lucky to be joined by a few other people. Firstly, our in-house Burgundy nerd, Sheila Flaherty. Hello, Sheila.
Hi.
We also have Guillaume D'Angerville joining us from his home in Volnay. Although relatively new to our portfolio, wine is built on relationships, one that Guillaume and my father have had for some time. And similar to our business, Guillaume's and D'Angerville is a generational estate as well, albeit hundreds of years older than ours. Hello, Guillaume.
Hi, everyone.
And last but not least, we have world-renowned wine critic Antonio Galloni joining us from his home in New York City. Antonio founded Vinous Media, which is a leading website for expert advice and reviews, something that our business uses daily. If you haven't subscribed to his website yet, I strongly suggest you do so. And right now, if you use the code word Volnay, you will receive a 30% discount. Antonio, good afternoon. Welcome.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks everyone for this. It's going to be a lot of fun.
So I just wanted to begin by mentioning a few things. Firstly, I hope everyone is safe and sound. I know we are all going through some tough times around the world. So thank you guys for taking the time out of your day to join us for what we believe will be a fantastic series. A thing that my team and I have come up with is came up with it, but virtual community. And, so often we meet in restaurants and homes, dinners with our friends and family, and we discuss wine. But it's quite easy to use technology to cross borders. And it's clear here, we have France, we have Canada, and we have United States all here on the Zoom call today. So it's quite unbelievable what we're able to do nowadays. A few things that we considered is what can we do in the interim to let alone use our time wisely, have some fun. And we believe that these webinars are going to sharpen everyone's skills and you're going to gain a lot of knowledge. I've been now with Halpern Enterprises for 5 years, although growing up in the business, I learn things and gain knowledge every time something like this happens or I meet with a winemaker. So I really believe this will be great for everyone who's here. The real idea of this seminar or webinar, or whatever you want to call it, this virtual community, Crew Classé, is we wanted you to have the ungoogleable things, the ungoogleable commentary that you will receive here. Briefly, I'll mention next week on Wednesday, we're going to be joined by Antonio again. So Antonio, thank you again for coming next week.
Sure thing.
Along with basketball all-star from Napa, Dwayne Wade. So stay tuned for links via social media and our email blast. We will be sending that out in the coming days. So I'm sure that'll be fun. Nevertheless, let's get started. And the first question I have was for Antonio and Guillaume. When did you guys first meet? What was Antonio, when was the first time you got to try Guillaume's wines?
The first time I tried Guillaume's wines was certainly before we met personally. We might have met at the Palais in New York before I actually started visiting the domain regularly. I don't remember. I think it's one of the things that happens with age. There's some people who you meet a lot of times in different places, because I also saw you, Guillaume, in Burgundy last summer in the music festival, music event. And, you get to know people and you sort of forget, it sort of feels like you've known them forever, and I think one of the things with Burgundy that's very unique, like Piedmont and other regions, is that these are wines made by families. And so over time you get to know, like your business, you get to know parents and grandparents and kids and siblings and winemakers who've been there forever. And so these are, in certain parts of the world, it's one of the things that I love about these wines and sort of handmade wines in general, is the fact that you're really, it's very, very personal. And you go into these cellars and a lot of times they're part of homes, and it's really not the big business that a lot of other wine is in other parts of the world. So I don't know, Guillaume, I don't know when we met, but I feel like I've known you forever.
Yeah, I do too, Antonio. I do too. I remember very well the first time I came here to Volnay. I don't remember the vintage, but I remember the discussion. And you're one of those people who came, and I knew that I was going to learn something out of the tasting. is, not always the case. Not
Yeah.
always.
Well, I'm not. I'm.
Uh-oh.
Oh, sorry. Bear with me one sec, guys. Someone is. Can everyone hear us now?
Yeah.
Sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead. Pardon me, Guillaume.
So I remember that discussion, and I remember our meetings afterwards. Always interesting, always nice tastings. And of course, now that you've Neil Martin coming to join you, and specifically covering Burgundy for you, Neil is also somebody that I had enormous respect. I have enormous respect for, and therefore it's very nice. It's nice to be with you today on this show.
Likewise.
So I guess, Dad, Colin, if you want to step in at any time, please do. But, one thing, Guillaume, your history, you weren't intending to really be in the wine business. And I know every time I am very lucky and fortunate to be tasting, and let alone when you're here or when we are able to be in France and Volnay with you, you often tell us the story. And every time I see him, it's more mesmerizing. So I don't know if you mind letting us know about your background and your family's background.
Sure. In a few words, and please stop me if I get too long, but this estate has been in my family for about 215 years now. It was purchased by my ancestor in 1804, and it is really remarkably the same as it was about 200 years ago. I mean, not much has changed in terms of the holdings in the different vineyards. So I'm only the 5th generation running this estate, and the person who was really important in the estate was really my grandfather, who arrived at the estate about 100 years ago, 110 years ago. And he proceeded to replant the estate, which had been destroyed by phylloxera at the end of the 19th century. And he's really the one to be credited for having restarted the estate in its current form. He was also quite a famous man in Burgundy because he became one of the leading forces against fraud, which was still quite common with the wine merchants in Beaune at the time. And people were mixing his wines with other wines and calling them Volnay nonetheless. And he got very annoyed with that, and he started suing those merchants. And as a retaliation against those lawsuits, the merchants said, well, we will no longer buy your wine in bulk because you sue us. And the result of that, of course, was that my grandfather had no other choice but to start estate bottling. And
sorry, he was one of the first ones in all of Burgundy to estate bottle, correct?
Yes, he was one of the first ones. There were quite a few around the same time with him. Like Rousseau, for example, was one of the early starters, and Henri Gouge, also in Nuit Saint-Georges, who was both of them were very much allies of my grandfather in their fight against the fraud. And so they all decided to start estate bottling around that same time in the 20s. Yeah. And then a little bit later, my grandfather was asked by his peers, the syndicates with at the time, the Syndicat Viticole, the local viticulture board, if you will. He was asked to actually put down on paper or write in stone, cast in stone, the actual hierarchy of the different Grand Cru, Premier Cru, village appellations of Burgundy. And that he did for the entirety of Burgundy, together with Henri Gouge in 1935. He was asked by his peers to do that. He didn't volunteer to do it. He was asked together with Henri Gouge to do that. And of course, it was, he didn't invent very much because at the time, most people already knew what the hierarchy was, but those two gentlemen actually put it down on paper, and it became Appellation d'origine contrôlée at that time in 1935. And so he became quite an important person in this in the region. And he continued to run the estate until the 50s, very early 50s, when my father arrived in 1950, actually, 1950, 1951. And my father himself ran the estate for about 50 years himself. I think he harvested 52 harvests, my father, from 1950 to 2002. And then, like Adam said, my father had actually encouraged me to have another life before going back to the estate. It was always in the plan that I was going to go back, but he thought it would be important for me to see something else, and possibly in a completely different line of business. And I did follow his advice. I didn't like it at first, but I was a disciplined young boy, and I agreed. I went to business school, and I went into banking, which I think is one thing I share with Antonio, if I'm not mistaken. I went into investment banking, and I spent about 25 years in investment banking before returning to the estate when my father died in 2003, which is now 17 years ago. So,
you referred to that first vintage as kind of baptism by fire, correct?
yeah, well, my father died in July 2003. I don't know if you recall that vintage, but it's a heat wave. It was a huge heat wave in Burgundy, or in France, generally speaking, in fact, in Europe. My father died mid-July, and at the time of his death, he and I were discussing starting the harvest maybe on the 10th of September, and then it became the 5th of September. Then he died, it became the 1st of September. And then eventually my brother-in-law and I, my brother-in-law was working with me at the time, we decided to start on the 23rd of August, which was indeed baptism by fire, because this was a very, very unusual vintage, very unusual vintage. I was a rookie, complete rookie, of course. And on top of that, I was starting with a vintage which was quite spectacularly out of the ordinary. So that's why I've referred to it as baptism by fire. Yeah.
Did you have, kind of getting back there, did you have mentors and people that you leaned on? Because that must have been quite challenging to just jump in.
Well, like I said, my father, before he passed away, my father had asked my brother-in-law to work with him as a consultant part-time. And when my father died, I said to my family, I think we have a common goal, which is we want the estate to remain in family hands. But I would agree to quit my job at JP Morgan, which was a nice little job, quite comfy at the time. I'm happy to quit that job, but under certain conditions. And one of them was, of course, that I would be my own master and that I would run the show without having to report to anyone. And also that my brother-in-law would agree to continue to consult with me and help me transmit what he had learned from my father. So he became, Renaud de Villette, his name is, he became the transmission cord, if you will, between my father and myself. And I was extremely fortunate to have him alongside me. So he was not really my mentor, but he's the guy who actually downloaded on me, if you will, everything he'd learned from my father. And my father would have been my mentor otherwise. We had, as a plan, we had a situation where we were going to overlap for some time, but it didn't happen that way because that's the way life is. But I was, like I said, I was fortunate that I had my brother-in-law alongside me to help me. And of course, many people helped me at the time, many people. And it's possible that perhaps it's a good time to give them credit. But my buddies from Volnay were very, very nice to me. In fact, the Lafarge family, very close. At the time, Michel was very much alive and kicking, and he was a fantastic mentor. Aubert de Villaine offered help himself, which you don't, you don't say no to help from Aubert de Villaine. Jean-Marc Rouleau helped me vinify my first vintage of Meursault Centenot. I didn't even know how to run a press for white wines. So all of this happened very quickly, very suddenly, I could say brutally, but in the end, it turned out nicely because a lot of people offered their help, and I was fortunate to have them around me.
Well, kind of on the topic of mentors, Antonio, did you have any when you switched over and started into wine writing?
Yeah, I mean, I've been really lucky. I had, I think, the best, because I'm probably one of the very few people who's had this incredible privilege to work along some super talented people. I mean, the first person who got me into wine was my dad. You know, my parents, but especially my father, because when I was a kid, he said the two greatest wines, apologies to Guillaume, but my dad, who did not have a lot of experience with Burgundy, so he's sort of a little biased, but he said the two greatest wines in the world are Barolo and Champagne. So, you know, that was my first mentor, but I would watch him taste. He would always, you know, my dad was not at all trained in anything, and he's from the post-World War II generation. So like somebody with a fourth grade education who becomes a successful entrepreneur twice. So my dad was and still is my biggest role model. But when he tasted wine, he would always pay a lot of attention to the aromatics and the color. And even though he was completely self-taught, he just had this appreciation for it. So I would say that he was really my first mentor in sort of getting me to understand these wines. Then my paternal grandfather in Sicily always had wine at the table. It was very, he did not, maybe because of what Guillaume alluded to with fakes, but he did not trust bottled wine. It had to be bulk wine bought from a farm. And he would get this white wine and he would put a peach in it. And he would have a half a peach with white wine every day for lunch and dinner. And this was important for me because it taught me that wine is a food and it's a nourishment. I mean, today, you know, everybody would love to probably weigh a few pounds less, but you know, there was a time when people drank these beverages for the calories, for the sustenance. And this taught me to understand that wine is a companion for the dinner table. It's a food, it's nourishment. So I never, you know, drank to excess or anything like that as a kid because I always saw wine as part of a meal. And then my other grandfather, my maternal grandfather, he had a corporate career at Quaker Oats and other companies. And so he liked Burgundies. And he was the first person he opened. I remember once Sunday lunch, it was a La Trissière Chambertin from Trappé. That's the first Burgundy I can remember tasting. And he would open Côte Rôtie and these other wines. So these were my three sort of family mentors. And then obviously when I started writing about wine, it was in business school at MIT just for fun. The story is that it was, you know, I always believe that life comes down to making the right choice in a very few select moments that can change your life. And I had this little newsletter on Piedmont wines, and I knew that I needed to incorporate it, make it a business, but I had no credits at business school left to take a class. So I go to this class that I'm not supposed to be enrolled in. And it was taught by a man that I thought was really captivating. And at a school like MIT, so many professors are very academic. And I'm a big believer in things that are practical. And so that's, to me, learning from other people as opposed to this totally academic approach. So this guy was a venture capitalist. He was a person doing deals, and he changed my life because after this lecture, I just went to say thanks for this lecture. That's it. So all I wanted was just to say thank you. And professors at schools like MIT, they have no time for their students. So I was expecting this to not be a very big deal. And then we started talking, and he said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I have this wine publication. He said, you know, his answer to me was, oh, my friend runs the website for Robert Parker. I should get you in touch. You know, so I went to a class that I wasn't enrolled in. I went to say hello to a teacher, which is not in my personality because I'm a very introverted person, and I would never do that as a natural response. I was never on a student, you know, a student leader or on the student council or any of that kind of stuff. I was very introverted. It's very unlike me to go say hello to a professor. And that person, he changed my life because all of a sudden he introduced me to Robert Parker's partner on the website. And within a year of writing the Piedmont Report, Robert Parker offered me a job. It's completely ludicrous. I had a year of experience. So in 2006, I went to work for Bob. So I had Robert Parker as a mentor, and we became very close at one point. We used to talk almost every day. So I learned a lot of things from him, and including a lot of things that are very delicate, how to deal with certain situations, which is, you know, priceless. We tasted together in Napa Valley, and I just sort of tried to download as much as I could from him. And then later in 2014, Steve Tanzer joined our team. So I had a chance to work with him. and he's, you know, probably the most active person still visiting Burgundy, who's American in the United States, at least, because I think he predates pretty much anybody who's active right now. He started tasting these wines in the mid 80s. So I've had a chance to learn from him and to read his articles and to ask him questions and to spend time with him. So I think those are really pretty great mentors. And then those are all people who are older than me. And then I always believed, because my first career was in music, what I wanted for Vinous to be was a place that attracted the best talent, because when I was a musician, I was only an average musician. And what I did was I learned from Miles Davis to surround myself with people better than me. Because Miles was never the best musician in any of his bands. He was great, but he created the context for people to create and to do things. So I always thought, how can I be like Miles Davis? How can I surround myself with people who are better than I am, people that I can learn from? Because when I was a musician, I wanted to be the weakest person in my band, because that meant I had the most to learn. And so I try to build this team by looking at who are the smartest people that I can put around me, that I can learn from, that I can be inspired from. And I've got people like that all over the place, whether it's Neil, you mentioned Guillaume, or Alessandro Masnaghetti, who does our maps, or Josh Reynolds. He's been going to Burgundy almost as long as Steve's been going to the Rhone for as long as Steve's been going to Burgundy almost. And so I've had a lot of mentors, but I don't necessarily look at those people as always being the generation above. I like to be surrounded by young people who inspire me in different ways. And maybe that's not quite mentoring, but it's inspiration. And so that was the whole vision behind our company, to have a place where people could really express themselves and be at their best. So sorry for the long answer, but I'm Italian and we like to talk with the hand.
No, it's actually interesting too, because you mentioned young people, and someone just asked a question right now. Guillaume and Antonio, speaking about fine Burgundy and saying that, I'll just read it. As wines are getting difficult to access and price are the main issues, how do we study and learn Burgundy when it's getting harder and harder to afford them?
Well, I have an answer to that one. And I really think it's one of the challenges that we need to face as wine growers in Burgundy. And I feel very strongly about that. And I personally have decided to continue to grow and to sell regional appellations for that very reason. Most of my fellow wine growers are focusing on Premier Crus, Grand Crus, sometimes Village, but very few now spend the time working on regional appellations as well. I do, because I feel strongly that it's the way that people can get an introduction to my estate. And in fact, I have purchased additional vineyards in Volnay, but in Burgundy Appellation Régionale, for that very reason. I want to spend time making great red Burgundy, white Burgundy, Bourgogne Aligoté, Bourgogne Pastoral, because that's the way the young generation who cannot afford Volnay Premier Cru, let alone Grand Cru, Chambertin, or whatever, for them to have a chance to get to know Burgundy, they must have this introduction through the regional appellations. And in that, with that perspective, I asked Daniel Jonas 2 weeks ago at the Pôle in New York to organize a special event, which was called Les Petits Vins des Grands Domaines, the small wines by big domains. And we were only showing regional appellations. I showed my Aligoté and my Pastoral. Jean-Marc showed the Bourgogne Blanc, Dominique Lafont showed something else. And we focused on that. And I think it's, there's no easy solution, but that's one answer to that problem, for sure.
Well, I'm drinking Bourgogne Chard, so thank you.
So can I add something to that?
Yeah, please.
I think that's obviously one approach is, you drink the lesser wines of the great domains. It's pretty hard to go wrong with that. I know when I go to Burgundy, there's still a few domains that I cover for us. Neil does most of it, but I mean, I love going to Morange. I love tasting Santenay. I love tasting these, even Premier Crus or village wines, but so above like Bourgogne, generic Bourgogne, from these other villages that are, I hope one of the things we can talk about at some point in this tasting is how climate change is influencing the wines of Burgundy. But for sure, there are places now where you can make wine of high quality because of attention to farming and better training, and also climate change, that maybe these wines were not that appealing 10, 15, 20 years ago. And for a young person, going to Burgundy or buying Burgundy for the first time, because part of the problem is it's hard to taste those wines. It's hard to buy them. And if you can buy them, you can get a bottle, so it's sort of hard to really educate yourself. But there are a lot of little appellations out there. Little is the wrong word, but there are a lot of emerging appellations, even within Burgundy, that are really interesting, and where the wines are still pretty affordable. For whites, it might be Macon or whatever, but there are still places where a younger person can find wine. You can buy 6 bottles, 3 bottles of something, and be able to afford it and drink a still handcrafted artisan wine that embodies all of the spirit that makes Clos de Duc and every other wine that is super coveted, that makes those wines special. But you can find those in these little villages that are sort of off the beaten path. And I personally love going there, and I love tasting those wines of those growers. So,
well, thank you for those answers, you guys. And we will have more questions. We're going to definitely jump into those. But one thing, I have people messaging in this over here, messaging me, emails flying in. What are we drinking? So
hold it, Adam. Let me interrupt for 1 second. I think Guillaume should tell the story why Clos de Duc is not a Grand Cru.
well,
because I think people will be interested in that.
I think he briefly alluded to the fact that his father was one of the people.
Let's start with the wines.
Okay.
So Guillaume and Antonio and everyone here watching, we have obviously mentioned we will be trying 3 wines. That doesn't mean that you have to have these 3 wines. We're going to be speaking about the terroir. We're going to be speaking about the 3 Volnays we're tasting here with Guillaume. But whether it's you're drinking Pinot Noir, whatever it is you have in your glass, an older vintage of Guillaume wines, or a Pinot Noir from some other producer, that really isn't the significant piece. The significant piece here is that we have 2 of the most incredible wine minds with us in a chat, that anyone in the world can really watch. So Guillaume and Antonio, if you guys want to really walk us through these 3 wines that we have here, and let us know what you guys are drinking, and I'm drinking them as well at the same time. So please.
Okay. All right. Well, just behind me here is a map that no one can see other than me, of course. But for people to understand Volnay, they have to bear in mind that it's a very small village in terms of acreage. There's only like 110 hectares of Volnay Premier Cru, call that 250 acres of Volnay Premier Cru overall. And that's split amongst like 40 different producers. So it's a tiny place, it's a tiny village. And the village is very peculiar because it's in the Côte de Beaune. Of course, it's just a few miles south of the city of Beaune, Côte de Beaune, but it sits on a hill, which makes it different from its neighboring village, Pomard, for example. It's higher up on the hill. In fact, it's in 2 hills. The village sits in between 2 hills, like it's often the case in Burgundy. There's a northern hill where Fremier and Clos des Angles, which are 2 wines that I have in front of me now, those 2 wines are on the northern hill of the village, and Champon is on the southern hill of the village. And of course, when we taste those wines, we have to bear in mind that the geology is different and the exposure is also different. We normally, when we do this kind of tasting, we would start with Clos des Angles, we would then go to Fremier, and we would then finish with Champon. And the reason for that is because Clos des Angles is the lowest on the hill. It's actually almost a flat vineyard. It's slightly slopy, but not very slopy, and therefore, since it's at the bottom of the hill, it has received a lot of earth, soil from the erosion over the millions of years where Burgundy was formed, and therefore the result of that is the vines have less work to do in order to survive and to live well. And the wine is very delicate. Clos des Angles is probably the most delicate of my range of Volnay Premier Crus, which, by the way, I have 6 different labels of Volnay Premier Cru. Those 3 plus Cailleray, Taillepied, and Clos de Duc, which is the monopole that Todd wants me to talk about. Clos des Angles, like I said, the beginning of the hill, quite a delicate wine, very lacy almost. And it sits just below.
Who is that?
Is there a problem? Can you hear me still?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Clos des Angles sits below Volnay-Fremier. And here you can see, if you see what I'm saying, Clos des Angles is fairly flat, and then Fremier is quite steep. And therefore, the erosion has taken the soil from Fremier into Clos des Angles, and therefore there's very little soil left in Volnay-Fremier. There's only maybe 1 foot or 2 feet of soil max before we hit the mother rock. And as a result of that, Volnay-Fremier is a wine which is much more mineral and a lot more structured too than Clos des Angles is. And one of the trademarks of Volnay-Fremier, which is the fact that it finishes on a fairly salty note, which is one expression of minerality, but it reflects the fact that the vines are going through the mother rock where 150 million years ago, there was an ocean here, and there is that salty mineral saline feeling at the back of the mouth of Volnay-Fremier. And Champon, the third one, is my biggest holding in the estate. It's 4 hectares in size. My holding is 4 hectares in size, about 10 acres, which is, like I said, my largest holding, almost double what I own in Clos des Ducs. And it's a very beautiful terroir. It's located, like I said, on the southern hill of the village of Volnay, facing plain east, very long rows, starting at almost the bottom of the hill and going all the way up to above mid-hill. The soil, the geology is quite different at the top from the bottom for the same reason that I explained for Fremier and Clos des Angles. But Volnay-Champon is often described, and I subscribe to that view, as kind of the style, the best example of what the style of Volnay is all about, which is, we always refer to the wines of Volnay as being very feminine, very seductive, very silky, very curvy. And yes, Champon is often all of that, with very integrated, lovely tannins and a very supple mid-mouth. In this vintage 17, certainly the case, for sure. I don't know if that's... Antonio, you want to add anything?
How could I possibly add anything? I'm a city boy, New York.
So Guillaume, I know we're tasting 17s now, but I actually think it might be a valuable question for some people here, and I actually think it's a question from me personally. 2017s, obviously these wines are babies. As we taste them, they're not. We know where these wines can go. In terms of, and Antonio, this you can answer as well. In terms of aging potential with these 17s or anything, if someone decided to open a 17, what do you suggest? How do you really find that aging potential in a wine, and how do you really pinpoint that? I know, Antonio on Vinous is unbelievable how many, let alone the write-ups that you guys have, but the suggested drinking windows are really important for many people. Many of our clients here in Ontario, I'm sure everyone around the world would agree. So if you guys want to, dip into that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of different ways to look at it. The first is having a lot of familiarity with the producer's wines. And that's one of the, you mentioned sort of our reviews and drinking windows. One of the things that we do is we publish a lot of verticals and retrospectives. There's 2 retrospectives of Clos des Ducs on Vinous, one written by Jay McInerney and one by Neil Martin just within the last few years, or Steve Tanzer, sorry. Neil was jealous he couldn't go. But it's precisely for that. I see on the thread here that, somebody's tasting a 2012, and again, that's a vintage with tiny yields. I remember going into your cellar, Guillaume, is like practically empty, and again, coupled with the fact that these wines do have, they are not necessarily the easiest wines for people to afford. I think that there's tremendous value in saying, here's a retrospective of this estate or this wine or whatever. So we try to do a lot of that. I think over time you gain familiarity with the producer. And then the other way to look at that is sort of looking at a vintage or other vintages that are similar. I think the thing with Burgundy is that these wines are deceptively age-worthy. I mean, I'm tasting Clos des Angles, and it's got a lot of, it's the first impression is, even for Burgundy, it's kind of light, but then it just really expands on the finish. And this wine, I mean, I don't think there's any problem with aging this for quite some time. And I think that is one of the things about Burgundy that's really deceptive, is the wines can seem light and they'll age for decades. You know, and this is the first wine of the tasting, and we're not going like even all the way up through the range. So, you know, I would probably, and the wine is delicious now, because I think one of the things that has changed, one of the biggest changes in the world of wine in general, is that wines are just generally more approachable young than they used to be. For sure, when I was a kid and I had the chance to taste things, I mean, even 20 years ago, wines like this would have been released and they would have been completely unapproachable. And I think that today there's just much more attention to the way wines are made, to farming, to sustainable approaches, to maybe not so applicable for Burgundy because the production is already pretty small, but in places like Bordeaux, where the production is large, they've moved towards smaller tanks. There's just much more precision all over the world. And so this one is actually really delicious today. I mean, of course, it's going to be better in 5 years or 10 years, but I think one of the things about wines is that in general, they're approachable younger than they used to be. And with the case of Burgundy, the wines will age longer than you think, than I think, even, because wine is magical like that in some parts of the world, and Burgundy is one of them. So it's kind of a long-winded circular answer, but the best thing to do is to drink a lot, responsibly, of course, but to taste a lot, to take notes of what you're drinking, and to build your own library of experiences. Because at the end of the day, you know, there are certain places in the world where people like more mature wines. You know, some very classic cases, the UK, where people love, you know, champagne that's very mature and nutty and honeyed. And in other parts of the world, people like wines that are more fresh, more taut. And that ultimately comes down to personal preference. So, you know, 17 is a vintage in Burgundy where their wines are a little bit light. And what surprises me about this one is how much density it has, because it's sort of unexpected to me, especially at this part of the range.
Yeah, that's one of the things, Antonio, which strikes me about 17 at the domain. It's that they are almost ethereal, the wines. They're very airy. They seem very light, but there is a lot of momentum in the mouth nonetheless. It's that combination of airiness and density and texture which makes this vintage, I think, particularly appealing. And to come back to Adam's question, I think these wines are going to be tasted and drunk early because they are approachable. Like Antonio said, they are very approachable today, and therefore they are attractive for a lot of people to drink early. But they will last. They will last a long time for sure.
And sorry, Sheila, go ahead.
I was going to say, question. Just in terms of élevage between the single vineyards, are they all treated the same, and has that changed much over the last?
Sheila, may I just quickly interject here? What is that? What is what are you talking about? For many people here, I imagine many people will understand what you're saying, but let's just enhance the question a bit.
So what is élevage?
Well,
oh, I'm leaving that to the winemaker.
I'm pouring wine.
I defer.
No, I will start, if you don't mind, I will start with viticulture, because before élevage, there is viticulture. Élevage is the period between the harvest and the bottling, to make it simple. And that lasts about 18 months in the barrel. But before that, there is viticulture. And one thing which has happened, Antonio referred to it earlier, is that I arrived at a time which is a very important time in the history of climate change. 2003 was my baptism by fire, for the reason that it was the first big vintage of an enormous heat wave that hit Burgundy and Europe as a whole. And it was the first vintage where we harvested in August since 1893. So it was a big marker in what followed, which is climate change. And by that, I mean, not just global warming, but also weather disruption. Weather disruption meaning, more hailstones than before, more accidents, more late frost than before. But at the same time, all of that being said, we harvest today grapes that are much riper, fully ripe, than a generation ago. You know, my father, my grandfather used to harvest at the end of September, sometimes even in October, and yet they had to chaptalize, they had to add sugar because the berries were not ripe enough, they were not producing enough alcohol on their own. I have not chaptalized in the last 17 years. It's not necessary, and that's a very good thing, because we just have in the bottle what nature has given us, and we actually today harvest totally ripe, fully ripe. We call it phenolic maturity as well as sugar maturity grapes, and that's, I think, making a big difference to the approachability of these wines early. Also, another thing that's making a difference is, I believe, but I cannot prove it, but I will say it nonetheless, is the fact that I converted the estate to biodynamic, which was something that was one of my pet projects when I arrived at the estate in 2003. I started the conversion in 2006 and finished it in 2009. And biodynamic, for those who don't know, is a subset of bio. So it's organic farming, but to that organic farming, we add a few special treatments, natural treatments to the vineyard that make it a special thing. So I think we have moved in a different world over the last 15 years, let's say, because of climate change. I personally harvested the seven earliest harvests of the estate since 1905 when my father arrived. I did those 7 most early harvests in the last 15 years. So it tells you something that in a space of 15 years, 7 of those vintages were the most early, the earliest vintages that we've ever made in 110 years. So there is a big change there, and that I think also accounts for the approachability of these wines. And then finally, to answer your question, Sheila, about élevage, there is no difference in élevage in those different wines. There may be a slight difference in the percentage of new oak. Normally, new oak at the domaine is very low anyway. It's about 20% new oak only, and perhaps in Clos des Angles it's 15. It depends also on the number of barrels that we make in a given year. But other than that, they are barreled in the same way and attended in the same way, usually bottled within 6 weeks from each other. So no difference there either.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sure.
Guillaume, what's your philosophy on whole clusters for your wines?
You know, I'm sure there's no right or wrong answer, but I feel that for my wines, whole clusters don't work. I've been taught by my father, who had himself been taught by his father, that distemming was the better way to proceed with our kinds of wines. And I feel very strongly today that it's the best expression of my wines when it's only the berries that make the wine. I'm always worried that whole clusters will bring some additional tastes which I will not enjoy in my wines. And I like the airiness, the clarity. I like the style of almost like an infusion in the vat. There's just berries and juice, and that's it. Of course, it has to be said that when I say that I distem 100%, I do mean it, and it's actually happening because the distemmers today are very precise. When my father distemmed 100%, of course it was 85% or 80% because the distemmers did not work that well. So we have gone one step further, I think, in that style. Because we distem 100% and we do it, we are able to do it. I tried. I'll share a quick anecdote. In 18, when we had that big crop, in Volnay-Fremier, which normally fits in just one vat. We had additional grapes. We had to use another vat. And I said to François Duvivier, who works with me, who's my right-hand man, we work together on the estate. I said to him, let's try whole clusters on that small vat of Volnay-Fremier. So we couldn't go all the way to whole clusters for the entire vat. So we did 50% whole clusters for that smaller vat of Volnay-Fremier. And we've kept it all the way. In fact, we've just only now reassembled the two vats. We had kept them in separate barrels all the way. And we tasted them separately and several times, and together as well, and together with other people around the table. And of course, blind, because otherwise you're biased. And most of the time we preferred the destemmed version. Most of the time we prefer the destemmed version. And so as much as I enjoy some whole clusters wines from other people, I don't think I will change this my way of doing it in Volnay. I think particularly for Volnay, the distemming is a nice approach. It does good. It does
so
well.
what we're tasting when we taste your wines is then, since the wines are made the same and they're bottled within 6 weeks of each other, this is why I love Burgundy, and why I think for anybody who wants to learn about wine, it's the great school of tasting, because what you really taste is the difference from place to place, right? 100% Pinot Noir, same vintage, obviously. These wines are never blend. You can't blend another grape, obviously. The élevage is the same. There's no whole cluster. There's very little new oak. And the wines are bottled more or less around the same time. So what you're really tasting is the essence of place. And this to me is why I love these wines, because I've just tasted, so I tasted the Clos des Angles, and then Fremier has much darker fruit, a much broader shoulders, much more power, much more concentration. And that's why, I mean, I think it's the great school. This is, I think, where I think I became a pretty good taster when I started tasting Burgundy, because you'd go to these cellars, it's freezing cold when people like me like to go, and you have to focus and you have to concentrate, and you can't ask a winemaker about a blend and there's no little dollop of this or dollop of that you can rely on for your tasting note. You have to really focus on what is unique about the wine. And so even just these two wines in this vintage, they're very, very different. And I think that's...
And I have to explain one more time to people that really Fremier is just above Clos des Angles. There's only one dirt road between the two. They couldn't be closer to one another, and yet they're very different styles because of that exposure, because of the slope, because of the erosion, and all those reasons make it for a different wine. And I can add to what Antonio just said, that I can walk to each one of my vineyards in less than 15 minutes. I can walk to each one of them in less than 15 minutes from the winery, and yet I make 6 different Volnay Premier Crus, which are recognizable year after year. They're different styles. They're different from each other every year.
Might be a good time. Todd was asking about Clos des Ducs and kind of what makes that monopole so incredibly special and unique.
And sorry, what's a monopole?
Okay, so in Burgundy, you share many vineyards with other wine growers. I referred to Champagne earlier, and I said that I own 4 hectares of Volnay Champagne. There's actually, the total size of Volnay Champagne is 11 hectares. I own 4 of those 11. I'm the largest holder of Champagne, but there are 7 other holders of Volnay Champagne, and they make their own Volnay Champagne. But of course, the name of the wine grower is different at the bottom of the label. Monopole is the opposite of that. Monopole means I am the only one who owns the label Volnay Clos des Ducs. Volnay Clos des Ducs. It's important to remember that in Volnay, there are at least 3, in fact, there are 3 different vineyards that have the name Duc is in them. So you can also get confused with that, but Clos des Ducs is the simple one, and that is a monopole from Volnay domaine Marquis d'Angerville. There's also Volnay Clos de la Cave des Ducs, which is vinified by Benjamin Leroux, and Clos du Château de Duc, of course, domaine Lafarge. But Clos des Ducs, simple, is a monopole domaine Marquis d'Angerville since we've owned the estate in 1804. It's a very special vineyard, very, very special vineyard. I refer to it often as my backyard, as Antonio, Todd, and Adam will know, because it sits just behind the house. It's like a garden behind the house. And it sits on the southeast corner of the northern hill of the village. And it's important to understand what I mean by that. It means that the top right-hand corner is the highest point, and the bottom left corner is the lowest point. And there is a double slope. There's a slope facing east and a slope facing south. And the slopiness, the steepness of the slope is about equivalent either side. So it makes it a very, very peculiar and in fact unique exposure to the sun in Volnay. Very nice drainage, very slopey, very good drainage, never any excess water on the surface, which is very important. The vines dislike very much water on the surface. They want water down on the ground, but not on the surface. And a good deep depth of soil there. In fact, 3 feet of soil before the mother rock, what we call white marls, a good combination of limestone and clay with a high content of limestone, very white soil, very stony white soil. So very unique terroir from that standpoint. Also unique because of, I will name 2 other specificities to it. One of them is that there are underground springs in that field, so that there is never any hydric stress in that vineyard. It shows when you go into a dry vintage, when there's been a drought in that vintage, Volnay will always yield more than all the other Volnays because of those underground springs. And the other specificity is that, like I said, it sits on the southeast corner of that northern hill, and it sits right there close to the valley that separates the 2 hills, if you will. And in that valley, there's always a breeze coming out during the summer. And it's very important for the vineyard to be cooled down every night by that slight breeze coming down in between the 2 hills. Pinot Noir doesn't mind heat, but likes to be refreshed every night. So that breeze is also part of what makes Clos des Ducs special.
So of course we have so many questions, and we could go on for hours, of course, as we have. I'm going to start one more question quickly for Guillaume. Is what goes into the bottling of Volnay Premier Cru? And then I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but that's the first one I have.
Okay, that's an easy one, but it has 2 answers to it, because before 2008, it had in there Volnay Piture, which is right next to Clos des Ducs. It's the parcel, the plot of land just north of Clos des Ducs. It had Volnay Mitan, which it still has those 2. And it had my grapes of Clos des Angles, which I only started separating in a separate label in 2009. But since 2009, it has only Volnay Piture and Volnay Mitan, which are 2 small holdings that I own in Volnay Premier Cru. And when it's necessary, I can also put young vines of Volnay Champagne or Volnay Clos des Ducs when I've just replanted. But in the recent vintages, in 17, there's just Volnay Piture and Volnay Mitan.
So production's still quite small in Village then?
Volnay Village is a small production, yes. Volnay Village is a small production, yeah.
So now, Antonio, I'm going to switch over to you here. One thing I love about wine and growing up with, Todd, my dad, teaching me so much, and us drinking wines and me blind tasting and me saying it's a Bordeaux and it's Spanish or whatever it is that it's so subjective, and that's really an awesome thing. I sit with my friends regularly and speak and drink and taste wines and say, guys, speak up, say what you mean. So one question we had in the chat was, is it a bad thing if a wine is light? And the second piece of that is, how is that different from it being elegant?
From being what?
Elegant.
Elegant.
I'm going to answer this like 4-part question. You said something really important, and I want to build on that for the person who asked, how do we taste Burgundy wines? Because you mentioned something that I think is really important, and that's putting together a tasting group with friends that you can taste these wines. So maybe a bottle of, to use Guillaume's example, maybe a bottle of Chambertin is really, really expensive, but maybe if you have a friend or you have a group of friends, you can, for a splurge, get together and open a really special wine, and you share it amongst a bunch of people so that the cost is not prohibitive for any one person. So that's just going back to that question about how you learn about wine. The other thing is, you asked about light. No, light is not, it's just an observation. It's not a remark on quality. Lots of wines are light. I mean, I see it right here, empty Domaine du Pelican 2017 Arbois the other night. I can see the empty bottle across my kitchen table. I think a lot of people know that I love Nebbiolo, Barolo, Barbaresco. Those wines have this color. See, this is this color. This is the same color of Nebbiolo. You're supposed to be able to see in Italian, you would say you're supposed to be able to see your nail through the color of the wine. So you can. There's lots of wines that are light. That is not pejorative. It's just an observation, and a lot of that it has nothing to do with ageability. You know, it's one of the things about Piedmont wines, but also Burgundy wines, that you can be fooled by the color and in the wine's ageability. They're very different things. I think wine ages based on some sort of magical thing that has to do with soil, and there's an ability of soils to create wines with extraordinary ability to age that can be very deceptive in young wines. And what else did you ask me?
How does light differ from elegant?
Well, I think light is just is an observation, and elegant is more of an adjective. It's more descriptive, and I don't know that they're the same thing. I think you can have richer, bigger wines that are also elegant and sumptuous, and they're elegant in a different way. You know, wines are sort of like people. These are living things, and there's lots of different ways to describe them. I don't think that light and elegant are necessarily the big things. Light is just so now I'm on Champagne, and it's a perfect example of the wine. Sure, this is the Pinot Noir color, and yeah, I guess next to the whole universe of wine, it's a lighter wine. But one of the key things that, especially, this is one of the things that Bob taught me actually, is to really focus on the finish of a wine, the persistence. And so this Champagne, I tasted it like 2 minutes ago. I can still taste it. This is something harder to describe because it's more, a lot of things that have to do with describing wines there's kind of like art and science. But yeah, I can still taste this wine. I tasted it 3 minutes ago now. So that's something in the wine. But you can have elegance in all sorts of wines. They can be lighter like this. They can be richer. They can be powerful. They can be more hedonistic. They can still be very elegant. So the description of wine is very subjective. And I think ultimately what you want to do as a consumer is get to the point where you're really comfortable understanding what you like. I can't tell you what you should like or drink. I can only say I've been to, I don't cover Burgundy extensively anymore, but if I go to Napa Valley or to Champagne or to Piedmont, I can say, this is the lay of the land. I've tasted everything. This is my view, but I can't tell you that you're going to like something. Just like I'm just wearing this black sweater, but somebody else might choose a shirt with squares. What's the difference? It doesn't really matter. You have to sort of figure out what you like. And there's a lot of it that's really subjective. We just try to give a very broad view of everything.
That's great. Thank you. And I think Sheila is going to lead us into some questions for Guillaume.
Great.
One of the things I wanted to ask about is the new designation in France, the vin nature, and how do you think that's going to, or what are your thoughts on that in Burgundy and people using that on their bottles in Burgundy?
Vin naturel, you mean?
Yeah, in terms of the new designation that it can actually be. My understanding is 100% organic. People can now use a designation for it on the bottles.
I'm not the best guy to ask. It's possible that it's the case. It would be actually quite good if somebody made clear exactly what vin nature means, because there's a lot of different ways to understand what that means.
I guess that's my hopes with it, is maybe it'll streamline.
Many people use it in a different way, exactly in a different meaning, and therefore my comprehension of vin nature, which which I think is the one that most people, most winemakers will use. It's a wine which obviously is organic, but is also without SO2, without sulfites. That to me is the definition of vin nature, and it is not something that I'm doing now. I'm being responsible and reasonable about the amount of sulfites that I put in my wines, but I don't think a wine that is meant to be traveling can be shipped anywhere in the world without some dose of sulfites.
I had another question in regards to Climat de Bourgogne. You're the head of that, correct?
Climat de Bourgogne, yes, yeah.
And so you led, I guess, kind of led the charge in having all the Burgundy vineyards labeled as UNESCO World Heritage Sites.
Well, at the time of the application, it was Aubert de Vilaine who was the president. I was his deputy president, and we worked on that together. It took us almost 10 years. We started the process in 2006, and we were admitted on the World Heritage List in 2015. So it took us almost 10 years, yeah. And since the inscription, since the listing, I have been running the Association des Climats du Vignoble de Bourgogne. Aubert retired from it and asked me to preside, to chair it in his stead. Mm-hmm. It's been a fabulous cause. It's been a fabulous cause because it's meant that I learned a great deal about Burgundy that I didn't know, and I think one of the best advantages of this application and the fact that we're listed is that people realize how unique Burgundy is, and Burgundians, local people, do not realize how unique Burgundy is. And this application and the inscription helped them to do that.
That's incredible. That's very cool.
Yeah, we're very proud, very proud of it.
Well, I know we said an hour, but Antonio and Guillaume, if you don't mind, if we continue, I know I have a lot of questions, and I know a lot of people in the Q&A are really pushing. So if you guys are free, I'd love to continue.
I've got a plane to catch. No.
So Guillaume, I'm going to bring this back to you because I've been lucky enough to taste 2 vintages with you in the cellar at the domain. So I was so grateful to be invited and welcomed there. Your white wines are unbelievably special. We're very fortunate. We're Ontario. We're receiving our first allocation of white wines coming this year. So I'm very excited to get those wines over here as quick as we can. I wanted you to speak about your white wines along with your project, Domaine de Pelican, because I know a lot of people are asking about it. I know how important it is to you, and frankly, we've been lucky enough to also represent it and bring the wines. And we've been, amazed.
Yeah. If we start first with Domaine D'Angerville in Volnay, my holding of white wine, as you call it, is my Meursault Centenot Premier Cru, which is about 1 hectare, just over 1 hectare in size. It's a nice piece. It's important to have that in mind that this is an area on the village of Meursault, which is often planted with Pinot Noir. And because it's a terroir that actually works well also with Pinot, not just with Chardonnay. But Meursault, being very smart people, when they plant it in Pinot Noir, they call it Volnay Centenot, because Volnay is a more appealing name for red wines than Meursault is. And so it's a very unique question that is often asked in the context of masters of wines or that sort of things. Where is Meursault Centenot? Where is Volnay Centenot? And people will say, well, Volnay Centenot is in Volnay, of course. And no, the answer is Volnay Centenot is actually on the village of Meursault. But when my grandfather, who I referred to earlier as the guy who actually replanted the estate in 1905, when he replanted the estate, he felt he had a lot of Volnays already, and he was very, very keen to have a white wine, and therefore he planted that particular area in Chardonnay in the early 20th century. And since then, my father continued and I continued. And of course, it's my only Premier Cru in white, and I have a special soft spot for it for that reason. And I will say I don't think my father would blame me for saying that, but I will say that my father's approach to white wines was that he would make white wines when he had made his red wines. You know, he was kind of a red wine guy, and he would, when he had time, he would finish the whites. He would be somebody who would say, first we'll have white wine and then we'll have wine, you know, that kind of thing. So, but I have a different view. I like to vinify white wines, and I pay attention to it. And like I said earlier, I was a rookie when I started in 2003, but even more a rookie for white wines than for red wines for the reason that I just explained. But Jean-Marc Rouleau, who is a close friend of mine, actually took me through the entire press system when I did my first press in 2003 of my Merceau Centenary without my father being around me. And he followed me. He has the same press, the same pneumatic press as me. And so he said to me, okay, you go 1.5 bar for half an hour, then we stop, then we call me again, and we'll move to the next stage. And I did my first pressing program live with Jean-Marc Rouleau on the phone, which I will never forget. But this is a terroir which is very special. It's to the north side, on the north side of the village of Merceau. Whereas most of the Premier Crus of Merceau are between Merceau and Puligny, south of Merceau. This Merceau Centenary is a very steep, very mineral terroir, very stony. And I make this wine to be that way, to be very tense, to be very electric in its style. So less batonnage, not much mixing with the lees, to avoid the buttery style that sometimes the lees will bring to the wines. Leave it very mineral, very clean, approachable early Merceau Centenary. And then I have a piece of Bourgogne Blanc, which also I think I gave you, Adam, a few cases.
Yeah.
Which the Bourgogne Blanc vineyard is located on the village of Volnay, actually, down in the flatlands of Volnay, but on the village of Volnay. And also next to that is my Bourgogne Aligoté, which is close to that same area on the village of Volnay as well. And in 17, in fact, we made a wonderful Aligoté. It was a beautiful vintage of Aligoté. And then, of course, you know, in that context, I was looking for ways to add more things, make more wines, and of course, it's very difficult to buy vineyards in Burgundy. It's very expensive, and there's a lot of competition for new vineyards when they come on sale. And therefore, I was looking for somewhere else to go that was close enough to Burgundy that I could really say that I am making the wines. I can sign my name on the labels without lying. So it has to be close to Volnay, but it has to be different enough for it to be a new challenge. And it ended up being in Jura for various reasons, but one good reason for it is certainly that there is proximity. It's only 1 hour's drive from Volnay, door to door, from one winery to the next, to the Pélican winery. And yet it's a very different region. It's a very different region because many things can be done there that are not allowed in Volnay, like blending, like oxidative wines, like, you know, plenty of different things that can be done there that I wouldn't be able to do here in Volnay. And so I'm very excited with this venture, which my first vintage was in 2012, and now we're in 2020, and we have now 15 hectares there as well. So it's similar size of estate, and in 5 different grapes, the 5 grapes of Jura, but 70% is in white, and in white we have Chardonnay and Savagnin. Savagnin is about 40% of total, and Chardonnay is about 30% of total production in Jura. And those wines are really fabulous. Jura is a very, very small wine region in France. It's only 2,000 hectares, so maybe 5,000 acres in total. So it's tiny, tiny, tiny. And a lot of the wines are consumed locally, and therefore there's very little knowledge outside of France of those wines. And but they deserve to be much better known. And they're also, to come back to an earlier question, they're also more approachable in terms of price. You know, they're attractively priced, let's say, because the land is much cheaper. We can afford to sell them at a much cheaper price as well. So that's all good news. And I know there's been a very good following in Ontario for those wines, as well as in the US, actually. And I'm delighted with that. And we're working hard. My learning curve there is still quite steep, where I continue to learn about the terroir, about the way the plant reacts to the terroir, about the, you know, the different climate conditions and everything else. But I'm satisfied that we are making wines that have a personality, that have something to say to the drinker, to the taster.
Well, thank you for that. Just in terms of time here, I want to jump into some Q&A. We'll do a few questions and then we'll call it a day. So I wanted to start off with a question that's going to be for you, Guillaume, Antonio, as well as my father, Todd. And I think I'm going to structure the order to start with my father, Todd, then Antonio, and then Guillaume, and we'll see how this works. I hope this doesn't create problems, but I thought it'd be interesting. So Guillaume, you took over the winery in 2003, and Laurie O'Sullivan was asked this question, but I'll expand on it. You took over in 2003, and I'm going to go to my father first. And Todd, what has been your favorite vintage from D'Angerville since Guillaume took over? And then we'll move it over to you, Antonio, and Guillaume, you can answer the question how you would like, but I know it could be a fun one, so please.
Well, I don't have a large collection of Guillaume's wines. I probably have about 10 vintages, but of the 10 vintages that I have, I would say the 2010 Clos Duc is one of my favorite wines that I've tasted of his.
All righty, Antonio, your favorite vintage overall of Guillaume's, if you've been able to try so many of them, or favorite wine even.
And luckily, I have this incredible fortune to taste lots of really great wines from like all over the world, and older wines and whatever. But I just don't think of wine quite that way. To me, wine is, sometimes people think that, people like me who give these ratings for these wines, that it's some sort of like a competition. But my concept of wine is really trying to understand each wine for what it is on its own, and it's never competitive. So, I never sort of do these blind tastings and say, oh, this wine is best and these other wines are not so good. To me, it's really trying to understand the degree to which each wine captures the personality of its place through the lens of a year and the hands of a person. And so for me, it's an impossible question to answer, only because I find beauty in lots of different things. And I don't really, my conception of wine is not at all competitive, or that this is the best or not the best. I really try to understand each bottle for what it has to offer. And, for better or worse, I'm a super optimistic person. So I'm looking for things to like and looking for things to appreciate, as opposed to things to not like. And, that may or may not be the right approach, but I'm not really I can't think of wine in a competitive context. I think of every wine for how great is that, or not, but what is that wine in the context of itself? So I can't really answer that. It's just not the way I'm wired to think about wine. I'm sorry.
No.
I will it suits me fine, those two answers, because I can be somewhere in the middle and not look stupid. I understand exactly what Antonio is saying, because as a winemaker, of course, it's very hard for me to say, I didn't like this vintage, I like this vintage. It's not easy to do that. But I think of wine always in the context of where I tasted it and with whom I tasted it and what were the circumstances. And of course, I share with Todd the fact that most of the time, my 2010s have shown very close to what I would like to be able to achieve almost every vintages. I love 2010, no question about it. But sometimes you will remember other vintages for other reasons, including, like I said, the company, including the special circumstances, including that particular pairing with the food, including many different aspects which are not just in a wine tasting. Yet, I will say something to you, Adam.
Yeah.
This is the first time that I'm doing this exercise of virtual tasting. It's very odd, but it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And I will always remember that tasting because it's the first time I do it. And therefore, I will have, I think, a very special memory of tasting that vintage 17 of those 3 different Volnay Premier Crus with you and with you all online with us. So, what I meant by saying that the way that you remember a particular wine also depends on the circumstances. And Antonio was referring to the vertical tasting that I did with Jay McKinney, and then I did with Steve Tanzer last April, a year ago, here in Volnay. And there were 2 very different exercises because at different location. With Jay, it was in the Hamptons. With Steve, it was here in Volnay. The company was different around the table. The serving was different. The time of the day was different. And if I look at my notes, I tasted the 2 wine, the same vintage of Petit in those 2 instances, and I had a very different view about them because of all those things that I told you about. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I can offer.
No, it definitely does. And a question for you, Guillaume, is going to come from a friend of ours that I'm going to pull in here, a little surprise guest. Bear with me one sec. Let's see if he can use the technology here. Bear with me one sec, everyone. Just promoted him to be a panelist. Oh, where'd he go? Etienne, can you hear me? Okay, we'll wait till his program is back up. But we have Etienne de Monti wanted to log in and say hello and ask a question for you guys. But one question for you, Antonio. What bass and what guitar and what amp are you using? We had that question roll in, so why not ask?
Well, you can't really see. Maybe you might be able to see it. The amp is it's just a little practice amp. It's a Fender Champ from the 70s. It's a silver face amp, and then this guitar is was made for me by one of the top guys in New York. His name is Matt Brewster. The brand is called Rust, and Matt is a guy who...
No, don't put it back. Don't put it back, Antonio. You're going to play something.
Only if you sing, Guillaume.
I think I've had too much D'Angerville Volnay, even though I tried to exercise restraint by using the Coravin. Matt is a guy who, if you go into his shop, a lot of the top pros are in there getting their instruments tweaked before performances or whatever. So he's like a guy who really caters to the working class professional musician. And he's got this line of guitars called Rust that he builds in his shop, a few a month. And he's made 2 of them for me, and they're just beautiful. And it's my approach to these instruments is it's a lot like wine. I buy the wines of the growers that I've met over the years, whether it's in Napa Valley or Champagne or Burgundy or Piedmont or Bordeaux or whatever, because when I drink a bottle of wine, I want to feel a connection to a place. We live in a world that's very standardized. This is a particularly strange period, but in most times of the year, if you so wanted, you could have the same Starbucks coffee almost anywhere in the world. We all have the same iPhones or Androids or whatever. The world is very standardized. And one of the things about those instruments is they're made by somebody that I can go in and talk to. And when he makes them for me, he says, hey, if you don't like this, we'll switch it out. And there's just a personal connection to something. That guitar was made for me. It's a one-off. I picked all the electronics in it. And there's just something, when I play that guitar, it's the same thing as drinking a bottle of D'Angerville or Rousseau Chambertin or Conterno Barolo or Pierre Peter Champagne or whatever. There's something about it it's not just an instrument. You know, people like to make fun of me. Sometimes they say it's not just wine. It's not. There's a family's history. There's a piece of land. There's a way of making things. There's a philosophy. That's all of what's in that glass you're experiencing. The vintage. Now the vintage is different. Thank God we have different vintages. I mean, everybody's got the same phone. Everybody's got the same cars. You know, it's good that there's some things that are different. That guitar, like the other one I have, is a one-off, and it's.
What does it sound like?
Well, before we let Antonio sign off with maybe a song or a little tune, I just wanted to say a few things as we close out.
We drink some more champagne.
Number one is from all of us at the Halpern team, we want to thank our guests Antonio and Guillaume. Thank you guys so much for joining. This is the first of hopefully many in this virtual community that we're trying to create. I know how important it is, and hopefully we give some people something to look forward to, whether it's on the weekend or the evenings. So really, once again, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for joining us. In terms of everyone watching, thank you guys for joining. Really, be careful out there. We know it's quite hectic, and just stay safe. One thing I wanted to mention about Halpern Enterprises, we're a company based in Ontario. For those of you that may or may not have heard, our website is halpernwine.com. You're able to order some of the wines that we did taste here just now, along with some wines from Domaine de Pelican and some of Guillaume's other wines. And you will be able to probably have access to the 2018s in early 2021. The next webinar will be Wednesday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern time, as I said, hosted with Antonio Galloni again and Dwayne Wade, along with his winemaker, Jamie Watson. And following a couple others to keep your eyes on, we're going to be officially announcing, and I guess this is as official as it comes. April the 4th, we will be welcoming Jeremy Sess from Dujac and Domaine de Trient on to have a chat with us, and maybe a couple other special guests, including Antonio. And on April 11th, we have the Antonori family, and at 1 p.m. on Saturday, we'll be announcing another one. So I really hope that everyone tunes in. In terms of the questions that we didn't get to answer, I'm sorry. We will be posting on whether it's our social media channels or whatever it is. We will be trying to answer as many questions. I'll be in touch with Guillaume and Antonio. Hopefully we can get to them all. I'm sorry if we cannot. Stay tuned to our social media feeds. If you want to watch this over, it'll be fully recorded and put onto YouTube, along with the Halpern Wine podcast, which you'll see in the next couple of days. That will have the audio. I really hope this was informative. I hope this was helpful. And once again, please stay safe. Thank you guys for coming. And Antonio, you want to sign us off now?
Yeah, so I'm going to play a little song. This is what it sounds like, Todd. That's the clean sound.
What is it? Let's hear a song from that guitar.
Yeah, I'm going to play something. I'm going to say, so this is something I've been working on in this time of self-quarantine. And so it's not a finished piece, so forgive me if there's mistakes. I've had a lot of the D'Angerville Volnay, I think. And but this is like tasting D'Angerville wine from the barrel. That's why I chose this. It's not complete. It's a work in progress. So this is a Jimi Hendrix song called Little Wing, and but this is the sort of the Sting version, which was recorded in the 80s, and the guitar solo was done on that record by Hiram Bullock, who was the original guitar player on the David Letterman band. And so the Little Wing is like this. It starts like this. Then Todd, this is the part for you. So it's a wine from barrel. It's not perfect.
Well, salute. Thank you again. Cheers. Until next time.
Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you, Antonio.
Thanks, guys.
Right.
Great to see you all.
Next time.
Look forward to the next one. Cheers.
Guys, if you want to watch this again, it'll be on YouTube in the next little bit. Thank you again for coming. We'll see you guys on Wednesday. Cheers.